is the 7th installment of our yearly seminar on the European public sphere. As our fans know, last year we had a full-year seminar on the austerity, and a large part of the discussion bore on the question of the democratic deficit in Europe, obviously about austerity politics in particular at the time, but we ended up thinking it would be a good idea to enlarge the debate, to try to understand the question of the democratic deficit in a larger way, and that's why we, and I, decided to have a seminar on the European public sphere. And to examine actually the perception and maybe the reality of the fragmented and dysfunctional European public sphere and its implications for European democracy. So we started the year with a theoretical discussion, working both Nancy Fraser and Etienne Balibar on the conditions of enlarging the concept of the public sphere to Europe, since this concept, as you all know, was forged to describe the process of democratization within national spaces. And then subsequent seminars throughout the year were devoted to the presentation of more empirically grounded work. And each of these seminars centered on a specific aspect of the European public sphere by evoking some of the conditions of production and disseminations of ideas in Europe today. So we had a seminar on the question of language in Europe, on the transformation of media, on the transformation of the world intellectuals, on the growing role of think tanks and political foundations in Europe today. So we were very interested in thinking about those, I would say, empirical conditions of the public sphere. Tonight, for our last meeting, our last seminar, we go back to the circle, maybe with concluding remarks to a more general discussion and maybe more theoretically grounded discussion on the European public sphere with Craig Calhoun. And I could not think of a better person to wrap up the seminar, because Craig's work has been dominated throughout the year by keen interest in the contribution of the social sciences to the public sphere, to the understanding and to the making of the public sphere. Craig Calhoun is a sociologist. He holds actually an MA in sociology and anthropology from Columbia, more or less. This is somewhere.
More or less.
I understood it was a little less than that, but it's on the internet somewhere. And he holds a PhD from Oxford. As you all know, he has contributed to widely and deeply to the field of social theory, but always with the same preoccupation, I think, that as I was in this seminar, always fed with a dialogue with empirical sciences, with sociology, with history. He has written many books, both edited books and books of his own. I won't quote all of them. I will quote them, those that I've read with a lot of attention, the one on nationalism that has been edited several times, and the book on China, which is maybe his best known book, on the Tiananmen protest of 1989, which is called Neither Gods Nor Emperors. Craig has had a very brilliant career, which had some involvement with Columbia for some time, but he's been for a long time at UNC, and then he was at NYU, still at NYU, professor, you still know, you know, we're at NYU. So he was a professor from 96 on, recently, 2012, and at NYU he founded the Institute for Public Knowledge, and he was also, of course, the director of the Social Science Research Council from 1999 to 2012, and since 2012 he crossed the Atlantic and to become the president, the director of the both of the London School of Economics and politics.
Political science.
And political science. Science. Okay. So for all these many reasons, we're extremely lucky and happy to have Craig tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm overdressed and I'm also hot. I'm not going to continue to a striptease performance of the entire show. But So I do have a long engagement with Columbia. I'm, to be more precise, I'm MA in anthropology and ABD in sociology. I left without finishing my doctorate and did eventually finish a doctorate at Oxford. I joined the Columbia faculty and also left that in a premature way after a year and a half or so. So I have a history of loving it and leaving it. I still love it. If you don't like my talk, I will be leaving very fast afterwards. And I will speak with some generality, as perhaps befits a wrap-up. I'm not so sure about the theoretical depth. You'll have to judge. And let me begin with a not so theoretical, practical moment of the talk, and explain what I mean by dream of the democratic republic in a slightly roundabout way, starting with, I'll come back to universities. The LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science, is under occupation at the moment. About a month ago, just over a month ago, a small group of protesting students and others took over a suite of 2 rooms on campus and declared the creation of the Free University of London. This was not in imitation of the Free University of Amsterdam or the Free University of Berlin or another set of free universities with a different image of the term. It was something that connects to different ideas of freedom. Ideas about free intellectual inquiry and how it might be distorted. Ideas known here. Ideas about free from cost that are a little more complicated. The students issued demands, the first of which was for, and I quote, free and universally acceptable education. They elaborated this by saying first that it should not be for profit. The LSE is not for profit, so not a complex negotiation there. But then they said, well, we mean there should be no fees and no charges. More difficult for us to implement. And that it should be free to everyone, not only British citizens. The LSE is actually a state university, not clear about that, though not entirely funded by the state, and certainly not funded by the state to provide free education to everyone in the world. So on hearing the demands, the list of demands that began with the, we will occupy the LSE until it provides free and universally accessible education, my first thought was, absolutely. We all believe in that. And my second thought was, this is wildly naive and unrealistic. And this talk is about believing in wildly naive and unrealistic things. Or perhaps I should say about the tension between utopian ideals and practical transformation of institutions and reality. But it's about this in a specific context. One not all that far from questions about cost or access or freedom and purpose in higher education, but not precisely about the occupation of the LSE. Let me elaborate very slightly, but really shift gears. The growth of modern universities has been deeply shaped by the dream of the democratic public sphere. This dream of the democratic public, I will suggest, is an old one, and I'm not going to try to go through the whole of this history. From Renaissance and Reformation and Enlightenment on, but it's one that has shaped the growth of a university as an institution. Universities are, among other things, and with differences in context, meant to educate citizens for public participation. They are meant to do this partly by exemplifying rational, critical public debate. That's why when academics gather, they discuss the big issues of the day with great insight and never simply departmental politics. In science, publication and openness about data are seen as basic to processes of the improvement of knowledge, partly through the continued correction of error. And so I won't elaborate, but one direction of discussion would be what is happening to the infrastructure of publicness in intellectual life itself. And there would be themes ranging from the debates over the availability of unbiased reviewers in pharmaceutical journals through to the issues of proprietorial ownership of research and its access to public scholarship and a range of others that are important. But universities aren't only publics. They have other agendas, like preparing students for employment and careers, making advances in knowledge that are valued for technologies and economic benefits, cures to diseases, and as well as citizenship. And indeed, personal satisfaction, not a trivial motivation for academics. There are basic challenges here that take us back to the issues raised, though only raised half explicitly, by the LSE occupiers. That is, at first, when I began to speak to them in a series of meetings, I think by free they meant it shouldn't really cost anything. They didn't mean somebody else should pay. But of course, on further reflection, when asked, they did mean somebody else should pay. And it provoked a conversation, for them a conversation about should that be the state. They didn't really like the state either. I might add, they are anarchists. And therefore, they have mixed opinions about the state. That was better than charging the students, but somewhat less good than actually being free. And their thoughts have evolved on this. I won't sort of dwell on their response. Say that they didn't ask questions explicitly like who pays for what it is they think should be free. Or questions like who gets in, about access. They thought, remember, universal access. So, is it taxpayers, parents and students, philanthropists who pay? And what are the implications? And if the payment is less than adequate to offer high quality to everyone, how is access rationed for universities? What rights do those who get admitted and pay have? How much hierarchy should exist? How should it be organized? Now I'm going to step back from these pivotal issues for higher education, just one more comment, and look at similar questions, or with similar questions in mind, at this dream of the democratic public, because I think the same sort of questions arise in general. The university is not only one of the creatures of the rise of a public sphere shaped by it, but it also exemplifies some of the issues that are challenges for the notion of a democratic public today, including issues like who's in the demos and who's not, and how is this related to resources, and what structure of inequality, how is it compatible? It's not irrelevant to the occupation of the LSE, for example, that the majority of the students are not LSE students who are occupying the space at the LSE, and that the protest was initiated by Dutch students arriving in the wake of the recent protests in the Netherlands a few months ago over the issue of cost and control in higher education and seeking to make an international movement. They didn't evoke, I won't say whether they knew or not, they didn't evoke a history of this. It could have been an 1848 story. It could have been a story of a variety of periods in which émigré intellectuals, sometimes with radical ideas, moved around Europe, reshaping both national and international European history in all of this. The issues are different in the UK, where higher education is organized and funded somewhat differently from the Netherlands and from other countries. There are still these national differences, but they don't completely dominate the story. Now, this talk is organized in 4 parts. First, the most formal part of it, I will offer what really still only amounts to a sketch, gesture into some history and theory. Especially at the end of this, I will pay particular attention to the idea of a unified public sphere and popular agency. So just to foreshadow, a theme that runs through some of the theoretical and other debates over the public sphere, or what gets now often called the public sphere, is can you say the? Can you use a definite article? Right? You have to say publics and recognize a kind of diversity of these publics. Nancy Fraser, who we heard from, is one of those who has encouraged the notion that there shouldn't be a claim to a hegemonic public sphere, that there are multiple subaltern publics and other publics. And this raises a question, but it raises a question that has both political and or practical and political roots, and a sort of philosophical issue that travels under the name of what is metatopical agency. And I'm not going to go into that in enormous detail, but let me just suggest it has to do with things like, can you say there was a subjectivity to a democratic public, that it acts in some sense, as a subject, and what does it mean when you try to say something like that. After this, I will take up tensions between ideals and practicality with special reference to institutions and moments, transformative moments, and the relationship between publics and counterpublics, prominent in the literature. Then I will look, and only very telegraphically, just evoke a few of many challenges to the vibrancy of public spheres, the nurturance of critical reason. And finally, I shall speak briefly of hope. This is significant because my talk, like others, may deprive you of hope. And there is a tendency in the literature on the public sphere, both the most serious academic literature and broader, more public discussions, for a narrative of decline to dominate. Sometime in the past, the public sphere was great. Probably it was in the 18th century, the Enlightenment, and that day of dramatic democracy in France, which possibly is not your actual model of democracy if you stop and think about it, which thrived, among other things, in salons with a patronage of royal and other elite members, which worked in a complicated way, but evoked aspects of what we believe is paradigmatic for the public sphere. Possibly it thrived in the revolution itself, or possibly the model is the Scottish Enlightenment, the era of Hume and Adam Smith. Possibly there are a variety of other models, but what I want to suggest in this is the common narrative of decline. The narrative, well, the US Senate, it's pretty pitiful today. It is, I don't challenge that view. But, right, the narrative that says it was once the great debating chamber, if only we had, again, this is a narrative about an era when elections were bought for barrels of alcohol and when the relatively populist movements of that day were nurtured by key political figures. And the Senate was both based on, in many ways, a narrower franchise and in its organization as closely linked from different ways to money and inequality as it is today. So the narrative of decline presumes often golden ages. To raise questions about the golden age. Among Columbia faculty members, Michael Schütze has made a sort of specialty of raising some of these questions. But it's not just the golden age. It is the fact that I think we confuse the issues of ideals and institutions. That in this particular discourse, including in its academic literature, the commitments to a set of very strong ideals are made to appear practical or significant only by being embedded in claims that this existed once, sometime, somewhere, and therefore it can. And I think that there's a problem in that, which is while it can give us optimism for a moment, it tends to lead us to an account of all the reasons we don't have a democratic public sphere. And there are plenty of those, but I think they aren't sufficient to suggest the ideal is irrelevant. Now, the history and theory treated sadly as background, though I actually like them as foreground and primary subjects under ordinary occasions. The promise of democracy, at least in part, is that citizens can make collective choices not only about short-term policies, but about the kind of institutions and future that we, want to have. Much political debate is about the very immediate. And sometimes we tend to confuse democracy with how we make these very immediate decisions. There are relatively few constitutional founding moments, the kind that Hannah Arendt celebrated, talking about US history, or even the beginnings and early phases of the European community, European Union. But there are times, and recurrent times, when we reshape institutions. This is basic to democracy because it means really changing the conditions of our collective life together, as opposed to simply meeting certain practical challenges. The possibility of doing this turns not just on elections and other constitutional features of democratic government, but also on commitments to some idea of the public good, even the very idea that there is a public good, and participation in public communication to establish what it is and guide its pursuit. This is a claim against the authority or necessity of monarchs and dictators, but also for the possibility of choosing a way of life and an organization of social solidarity, by contrast to simply inheriting them or putting up with what is engineered from above or emerges from other sources. Not surprisingly, there have been many skeptics. In 1925, Walter Lippmann famously suggested that the public was a phantom, at most a reference point for establishing the collective interest, but not a meaningful part of the process for ascertaining what policies would actually serve that interest. Solving problems, he said, required experts and effective administration, but not large-scale public action or debate. Lippmann's argument is probably most remembered today for occasioning John Dewey's counter-argument, but it actually was itself a widely influential argument. Dewey, in response, offered a spirited defense of democracy and the centrality of public engagement to democracy. There are many aspects of this. This is where Dewey outlines some of his ideas about democracy as necessarily an educative process. That is, a process not simply of decisions among already fully formed people, let alone a fully formed public, but of the self-education of the people in public, key part of Dewey's ideas. In a sense, Lippmann can be seen as the foil to the entire ensuing development of the academic study and popular discussion of democratic publics. He said they don't matter much, that the real work of policymaking and problem solving inevitably gets done by political insiders. Most people are mere bystanders, not agents. Most lack technical mastery of problems sufficient to solve them, and therefore that democracy itself is best limited to elections that check abuses of power or resolve crises. Now, you'll be familiar with history's large parts of political theory that articulate this, as well as plenty of people's ordinary views. We're not short of skeptics today. Some worry that the technical nature of policy challenges is simply beyond translation into the less precise terms of public discussion. The European version of this is that there needs to be an elite policy sphere organized around the institutions of Europe, distinct from direct translation into politics in Europe. It issues in problems like the referendum, right? The production of a basic law that experts could love and the public couldn't understand, and its rejection in a variety of forums. Some worry that the public simply doesn't care. Secularization worries some, and the power of religion in the public sphere worries others. Trust in politicians and the media is low. Political parties are weak and relatively ineffective in focusing reasoned debate on issues. I will take this to be true pretty widely across the board. In some countries, such reasoned debate is literally banned. In others, thugs beat or kill those bold enough to raise questions about government policies. The print media have long sustained political public discussion, that have long sustained political public discussion, are in decline, not just in terms of their content, but it's the business model that sustains them is undermined. The broadcast television may not be far behind in this regard. Major questions of debate in Europe are how should states subsidize, whether states should subsidize, what are the impacts of different things. But here too, with mainstream media facing significant long-term change and decline in audience share. New electronic media offer exciting possibilities like interaction on a larger scale and over longer distances, but it is unclear whether these possibilities will outweigh the dominance of commercial and entertainment uses. There is a very large world of activist-oriented discussion of the internet and its potential for democracy, which for the most part ignores the extent to which the primary uses of the internet are gambling and pornography, and the amount of the internet which is controlled by proprietarial access restrictions, and therefore the difficulties in extending the mere fact of the internet to the democratic utopia that, at least technologically, it might potentially, under other circumstances, facilitate. The same new media have also chilled public life by their use to enable intensive state surveillance, massive corporate compilations of personal data on consumers, and new instances of what we might term involuntary publicity, as data sets are hacked and documents leaked. The term public, in fact, invokes involuntary exposure as much as collective debate. Not least of all, there is doubt as to whether transnational publics can develop adequately to meet the scale of transnational markets, social organizations, problems, and even governance. I don't know what Nancy Fraser spoke about when she was here, but part of the argument of her recent book on this is, in fact, that the public sphere simply can't keep up with the global organization of power. Reasons to doubt the project of the democratic public sphere seem as prominent today as they did in Lippmann's 1925. And to top it off, for many, the idea of liberty as a feature of collective public life advanced by government has faded almost to invisibility. That is, people have tended to lose touch with the idea that what they might want and expect and actually gain from government is an increase in liberty. There's a great deal of attention to how much government restricts liberty, whether that's necessarily true, as many of the new libertarians would suggest, or whether there are ways in which that cannot be true. But there is a loss, and here Europe is part of this, of faith in the idea that government could actually increase liberty. That is, that the democratization, the transformation of government, what's sometimes called the welfare state and other sorts of things, could be an agent of liberty in all of this. This has been replaced by an imaginary of markets and unfettered private property as realms of a purely individual liberty. Now, again, going into this story in detail, you'll hear me say that over and over again as I evoke things here. This is not simply a story of something that happened as though there were no agents. A shift in the way people think about public and private has been pursued for some decades by a variety of relatively well-backed interests. In this country and internationally, the Montefeltran Society, for example, which celebrates links to Friedrich von Hayek, although it's considerably to the right of Hayek himself, and I think unfair to his heritage. I have to say that because Hayek was an LSE professor. The Montefeltran Society has been part of a long-term campaign, largely but not only through the courts, partly through the media, and not insignificantly through financial backing of academics. A campaign focused on making the private seem natural and the public artificial. The idea that the private is a natural expression of individual liberty. The public is necessarily an artificial and therefore constraining construction. This appears in a variety of forms, but it's worth thinking about, recalling how much of the root of the idea of private is not historically or etymologically about personal liberty, but about deprivation. The common root with deprivation is lost. The reasons why a private soldier is the lowest rank in the army. If you listen to the new discourse, you would think that private must be the highest. But general is the highest, right? The contrast is indicative of something, right? A private soldier is one who, in fact, doesn't have others, doesn't command anyone, right? And lacks certain connections in the system. Right? As you move up through the ranks, you move to people who actually have large numbers of other people potentially at their deployment. You can't take that military analogy everywhere for all of this, but it's indicative of a certain shift in the very way we think about some of the core terms of the argument, and one that has been pursued, thinking, for example, about land use policy, or the rights of the press or various other media, and pursued through the courts to change the very notions of what's natural. That ends up issuing in a variety of Supreme Court rulings and others that are significant for the public sphere in the United States, issues in other complicated and sometimes restrictive policies in Europe, but also shaped shapes a European-US comparison. I'll just touch on again recently. In the US, this campaign has been associated with neoliberalism, and it's become one of the shibboleths to equate an American influence with a kind of dominance of neoliberalism. And I think that's not entirely helpful, partly because it allows one to think in terms of those large slogans and miss some of the institutional frameworks. For example, the European-US differences in copyright law, right, aren't due to neoliberalism. They predated the structures of copyright wars. It's a useful US comparison to this. They predated and are grounded in other features of the differences of legal frameworks and broad cultural orientations to how it is one might secure, right, the rights of authors. Specifically, to trivialize a large book, things like whether the rights of authors inhere in the person and expire at the end of that person's lifetime, or a property that can be transferred to others and thus passed on years after the original artist dies, in the case of art, but it can be software or anything else. So the notions of public, always partly dependent on the contrast to private, are available for reimagining in some part. The reimagining has been led, at least in part, by a concerted campaign. Now back to the 1920s, John Dewey answered Lippmann directly and almost immediately with an argument that publics were in fact needed in order to address the problems that arose from the indirect consequences of social action in complex, large-scale societies. Here a small admission. We won't hear often from academics, but I'm not up for tenure. I thought I invented this idea in the 1980s. When I read Dewey and the Publicness problem, to discover that he had invented this idea some 60 years before, I participated, here's a Robert Merton moment, flavors of Columbia history, in realizing how often there have been pre-discoveries, how often we can trace ideas back and stand on the shoulder of giants. But a basic feature of modern societies is that there are actions that create significant, sometimes negative consequences at a distance from those who choose the actions. They entangle people who in no sense choose the actions in them, and in indirect relationships, so that much of the organization of modern society is not an extension of our direct relationships, whether they are satisfying primary relationships or unsatisfying secondary relationships, but is in fact webs of indirect relationships shaped in various ways, including the markets and publics. This hasn't gone away. We could rethink capitalism, it would be a different talk, in part as an entire economic system for the production of externalities. And the ways in which externalities, many of them negative, not all, are produced and are organized becomes a basic issue for capitalism, and a basic issue about who pays, how we organize this. I'll touch on this in a moment. Dewey, in answering Lippmann, thought the actual performance of publics could be improved enough to make them satisfying both as problem solvers and in terms of the production of the long-term education and betterment of society. So he's optimistic in this. Better information, education, make them more real, less phantom. At the center of his analysis was an asymmetry he wanted to reduce between the capacity for a small number of people to make problem-causing decisions, including pursuing profits in ways that generate those negative externalities I was just speaking about, and the large number of people affected by them. Dewey was an unusual American in that he was an explicit Hegelian, in part. Famously remembered as a pragmatist, but the Hegelian side of his thought is significant. And here he put forward a proposition very much like Marx's vision of how class in itself would become class for itself. Dewey suggested that publics were objectively formed from all those affected by social actions, but became subjectively effective when they were organized and self-aware. He showed a clear awareness that large-scale active publics depended on social foundations that were at best underdeveloped. quote, modern state unity depends on technology and far exceeds the limits of face-to-face community. 35 years after Dewey, Jürgen Habermas responded to the situation he saw in post-war Germany. In a context of cynicism about democratic institutions, Habermas set out to show the unrealized potential of the public sphere as a category of bourgeois society. I have now fulfilled the requirement of everybody who speaks on the public sphere to mention Jürgen Habermas. Just a little more. Habermas looked at formally democratic institutions that had been introduced after the war in Germany, in which administrators had been carried over from the previous Nazi regime and public silence reigned, he said, on many important issues. The situation all too much resembled Lippmann's notion of the public as a mere phantom. Because Habermas's critique behind the Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit is, in some considerable part, that publicness is what's missing from German democracy, and he meets it in a range of different senses. And in fact, the translation of Öffentlichkeit could easily have been something like publicness in a way. It didn't have to be a spatially bounded notion like the public sphere. But here, his idea is that an animating part of public life, of democracy, is public life, is openness, is transparency, is talking about things that people may otherwise silence, as well as engaging more and more in the capacity for collective decision. This was precisely picked up on by Max Horkheimer, who applied leverage to Theodor Adorno and who shaped the rejection of Habermas's book as his Bildertaschenschrift at Frankfurt, leading him to go to Marburg. They rejected it precisely because they called it voluntaristic. That is, it would do what Nazism had done, encourage the less educated people in society to participate actively in public, and this would be dangerous. So the stakes of this are outlined in significant ways. Now, for Habermas, there were negotiations going on. Negotiations, for example, among business, labor, and political leaders, but not an open debate about the character society should assume, or still less, the implications of the Nazi past. But it wasn't just Germany with the Nazi past. Versions of this, he thought, reigned widely. In contrast to such negotiations among interest groups, Habermas celebrated the emancipatory potential of a collective discourse about the nature of the public good and the directions of state action. This could be free insofar as it was rational, that is, based on the success of argument and critique rather than the force of either status or coercion. Pause on that for a moment. There's a lot of talk and a lot of Habermas's interest in how to operationalize that. The idea is not a complicated idea. It's that the best argument wins in a debate, rather than some reference to who is making the argument. And this has some interesting operationalizations, like the prominence in the late 18th century of anonymous or pseudonymous letters, Federalist Papers in the US case, but a variety of versions around this. The prominence of people not using their explicit personal identity to sign the references in public. The issue that still dogs us, and which we tend to say now, a great problem to the internet is the anonymity behind the statements of people who easily become trolls and who debase the conversations and turn it to hate speech. But it was, in fact, praised by the leaders and many of the important articulators of the public sphere of the late 18th century, the most frequently claimed golden age, because it was a way to ensure that it was the argument and not the arguer that dominated the discussion. So this was a way of dealing with status differences. The public sphere, Habermas suggested, could achieve unity in some part by disregarding those particular statuses and particular interests in favor of the general good. He called for renewal of what he described as an 18th century ideal, the notion that ever wider circles of private individuals could join in rational critical debates. And I recall that this was an ideal noted by someone like Adam Smith, not always seen as a protagonist of this as well, expanding social circles. Disregarding their differences of status, identifying the public good common to them all, and their whole society, and so informing the state and public policy. The best version of the public sphere, he wrote, was based on, and I quote, a kind of social intercourse that, far from presupposing equality of status, disregarded status altogether. In other words, the solution to problems of inequality was not necessarily to eliminate the material inequality first in order to have a better public life, but to disregard differences of inequality in the institutionally structured nature of public life in order to be able to act on the truly common good. This worked by a mutual willingness, he said, to accept the given roles and simultaneously suspend their reality, his phrase. The attractiveness of this idea is demonstrated by the remarkable spread of the term. Here I will correct Emmanuel's lovely introduction of me in one small particular. She said that my book on China, which is actually, I think, my best book, was my best known book. I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure my best known book is an edited collection called Habermas and the Public Sphere, which is not a demonstration of my brilliance, but of the importance of both Habermas and this particular concept and term as they emerged. The phrase, the public sphere, not only gained prominence in several academic disciplines, but also became a staple of journalism and wider public discussions about the state of democracy and contemporary society. Debates over the public sphere arose in China, India, Brazil, Egypt, South Africa, and elsewhere. Public sphere joined civil society as a central theme in discussions post-communist transition, European unification, and explorations of a possibly cosmopolitan global future. It's not insignificant that Habermas's book was published in '62 and translated into most European languages other than English, but the English translation appeared in 1989, giving the phrase the public sphere a currency in a new context of debates. The book in French is L'Espace Public, and in many versions of it, there's a different translation. There's another story about translation histories in this, but in this one, the 27-year delay between publication and English translation made the book appear in a very different way and get tied up the notions of civil society and democratic transitions. Where Dewey had seen publics as responses to specific issues, drawing in all those affected, Habermas identified a more or less stable zone of publicness, the public sphere, located between civil society and the state, grounded in the former and addressing the latter. This was not simply an abstract ideal, Habermas argued. You can see this in the very form of the book. It is Habermas's only book which has the structure, at least in part, first half, of a historical narrative, full of concrete historical information rather than only an abstractly argued theoretical position. This ideal was made realistic by the development of a new pattern of social organization and ideas since the late 17th century that created social bases adequate to sustain it. Newspapers and a publishing industry, for example. Habermas didn't invent the wonderful term print capitalism. Benedict Anderson invented it to talk about the spread of nationalism, but it is what Habermas is talking about, the way in which a certain kind of business institution, the newspaper, was facilitative to a transformation of culture and collective self-understanding of large populations. Coffee houses, in which, among other things, people read the newspapers often aloud, and other publicly accessible spaces were equally important. And indeed, states, increasingly attentive to public opinion, were important. Habermas elaborated the social foundations of an effective public sphere in considerably more historical depth than Dewey, though a variety of people have been writing PhD theses and working on that ever since. The issue of foundations, the infrastructure of public life, is important. In the first place, the infrastructure turns the abstract normative potential of public communication into imminent possibility. Secondly, the infrastructure gives publics their contours. You ask about access and who gets in. Does it depend on literacy, for example? The 18th century flourishing of the public sphere was without mass literacy everywhere in Europe. So this particular golden age was structured on the basis of print media that were themselves intrinsically exclusive. Now, they didn't admit only the rich and powerful, the aristocrats or the emerging bourgeois. They admitted a variety of craft workers and others, but they were highly selective in who they admitted. The organization of secondary transmission, that is, reading them aloud in pubs or coffee houses to people who weren't literate, expanded this, but it's not insignificant that the flourishing takes place in a context where the technological infrastructure is restricted. It's not completely different from debates about the extent to which people do or do not have access to the web today in various developing countries or other contexts. The shaping is not just of who is a participant. The term access is slightly misleading. It shapes who's connected to whom in a variety of ways. It organizes the internal topology of the publics as well. Public communication is organized not just by the conscious choices of participants, moreover, but as a byproduct of the organization of settings and media for communication, most of which, of course, don't have their purpose as creating a democratic public sphere, but as doing something else. The beginning of the newspaper story involves merchants who want to get price data from other cities and track ports and so forth. The businessmen setting up coffee houses are often in the business of making money. Habermas emphasized a late 18th century transition from aristocratic salons and early literary magazines to both more open and more political discussions on new foundations. He stressed that as newspapers grew as businesses, it revealed that crucial supports for public communication can, in fact, come on for-profit economic bases. One bit of the argument is to suggest, to remind us, that the notion of civil society is actually grounded on an appreciation for capitalism and business as parts of civil society. I make the same point with Adam Smith, whose account of the invisible hand is in part a demonstration effect. It's intended to show that people can be organized outside the control of kings and government, that they can self-organize. We have come to equate both business and government with distant systems by that impinge on freedom. This was not the account at the time in all regards. As later critics noted, Habermas' account is wanting in various regards, and I'm not going to go through the kinds of critiques. One striking one is that neither science nor religion figures. It is neither of what might be considered the two largest waves, precursors to the modern public sphere in Europe, the rise of science with its invisible colleges and its communication networks, nor the religion with printed sermons, churches, and all of this figure in the story. Now, you could very well have started the story in the 17th century rather than the late 18th century. Now, changes in technology and social organization have continued to matter, and they matter into the present day. All sorts of other things happen, but the issues remain along the same. As television happens, but public management or subsidy, license fees or subscriptions, commercial sponsorship, similar sorts of organizations organizing the public sphere. Habermas, though, left implicit one of the most important infrastructures for publicness, cities. Never discussed or made a theme in the book is the rise of the city as itself part of the story of publicness. Yet early modern public life was overwhelmingly an urban phenomenon. Market squares and certain street corners were important public spaces, not just coffee shops, but public houses, gardens, parks, churches, and schools supported public gatherings. While some grew as small businesses, others were the objects of collective struggle and state guarantee, as citizens tried to ensure that they would have the spaces for public life. And this is a story, again, with different local and national characteristics throughout Europe. Also left out of Habermas' story, as Knecht and Kluge famously argued very shortly after it, are worker struggles. But part of the worker struggles, not fully embraced by Knecht and Kluge, was a struggle for public space. Edward Thompson makes a nice point about Greenham Common in London. Greenham Common, if we remember it today, we're apt to remember for anti-nuclear weapons armament protests near the end of the Cold War. means of green and common in this term. It's also significant that these were among the most prominent women-led protests of an era like feminism. But green and common existed only because it had been fought for by workers in the late 18th century, trying to preserve commons, trying to preserve open spaces for various purposes, including leisurely walks, not only for public life. So there's a longer story, a story that involves class struggle in a different sense, and a story that is over the space of cities. This is not trivial today because cities are changing dramatically in this regard. Just to evoke it, the early modern cities into the very beginnings of the 19th century were cities that had a certain operatic character to them. They were staged around central squares in many ways. The stories of successive French revolutions always figure the Hôtel de Ville. They figure certain stages, if you will, of the revolution. There's a sense in which the Venice of opera becomes the Europe of popular politics at its birth. Right? And popular politics is marked by a kind of pageantry that can be organized in public space, but also by the physical locatedness of some of the objects of state power. You could, in fact, seize the Hôtel de Ville in a way you can't seize the institutions, even in still centralized France. The cities changed beyond this. They have proportionately less public space. Part of the drama of Occupy Wall Street was that Zuccotti Park, the public space occupied, was private property, structured so in the course of development and rezoning. That is, it was to be not built on, but it wasn't actually technically public. And there is a reorganization, a decline in structures of public space, public access to public space going on. Here we see some interesting European-American differences. Just to note and evoke one of them, that Americans are much less tolerant of surveillance, even though more willing, in some cases, to have other kinds of identities. Britain, in particular, I know best in Europe, but actually much of Europe is vastly more tolerant. It is filmed all of the time. Europe is the Truman Show, right? That is, everything is on film all the time, everywhere in public. Right? There are no fewer than 67 cameras filming Trafalgar Square all the time, right? Now, this is something that bears on public space in cities in a significant way. Now, small towns and villages also have spaces for gatherings. It's not that you can't go out downtown, find centers. The issue isn't just that cities had more, and we now are losing them. It is that in cities, these spaces more often bring strangers together. Publicness is necessarily shared, but publicness is only one form of sharing, that which is open to strangers, to people who are not connected to each other in a tight web of personal relations. There's a slippery issue of scale here. We wouldn't call a family exactly a micro-public. Right? Community is usually people, understood to be people who have relationships to each other. As Michael Warner's argued, publicness has in part to do with the sociability of strangers. Right? And even more, it has to do with being able, having capacities to navigate the world of strangers. Richard Sennett, for example, famously speaks, Fall Public Man, of the public man is someone who's comfortable in situations that have no links or parallels to what is familiar to him, and traces again Haussmanization in Paris, but a variety of stories of the transformation of European cities, the way they changed public spaces. Again, here, Jane Jacobs praised the public character of 19th century cities, their sidewalks, cafes, and human scale, and mixed-use neighborhoods, and deplored its loss in 20th century transformations. Now, there is a long story, a large literature, and not much time. So one could go on and talk about other great figures to be evoked on our end. C. Wright Mills and a variety of others who contribute to this literature on into the present day and transforming history. I want to shift gears and briefly, before ending, raise some issues, in a sense, conversely to building out this account. And the first one has to do with decisions of cities. and that word, that odd idea of the metatopical agency relates here. We can see it by talking about markets. You'll see the connection. Right? It was common usage to speak of a market as a place. Not so long ago, you went to the market. Right? That could mean a store, but before that, it of course meant a market, like a town market that organized the sale of produce from the countryside around it, or goods that were brought in from other towns in a growing division of labor, some made metal goods and some made shoes and so forth. And markets are closely related to publics. They remind us that not all relations among strangers are public, or at least not in the same sense, and that not all relations that are open constitute publics. So thinking about this is tricky. When markets were in physical places, or are in physical places sometimes, the coincidence could be very strong. Publics and public knowledge and sharing of public information grew in large part from markets, from people coming together in markets and gossiping at the same time that they were also trading goods, sharing news. News could spread from one market town to another in circuits. And there are a variety of vectors and networks for this. One came to the market to buy and sell stuff, but also to acquire and disseminate information. The news traveled in various ways, so even before the newspapers. The urban merchants who were pioneers of the public sphere in the 18th century, right, were connecting up their different coffee houses, different global settings. But in this, we see at the beginning of a change. Markets become, to some extent, metatopical. What that term means in this context is a double meaning, actually. First, that we begin to speak of the market as all of these exchanges summed together. It loses its connection to place. Markets become longer distance, the friction of distance is reduced. But also, right, the market becomes understood as a set of functional mechanisms that organize supply and demand and so forth, and that work. And so we have not only a market, the market in this town or the market in that town, but the market. The market is, in its early modern constructions, tendential stories, largely a state structure of understanding, but it can, of course, expand and become global in all of this. Well, the same thing happens to the public in this sense, and this is key to the Habermasian notion. There aren't just publics, Habermas is saying. There is the public. The organized public of a country, the public sphere. It's organized in relation to states, and transcending states is one of the challenges today, but it's also conceptually tricky, and I won't go into this in much detail, as they've just announced a few things we can talk about if you want to know all of this. The idea of being metatopical is also a claim that different topics are, in fact, all in the same public. So one of the lines of critique that has come about public spheres is actually something very directly part of what is being talked about. That is there a public sphere that is the same public sphere when you want to discuss women's rights and housing prices? Right? Or are those different publics, different public spheres and different contours? So the claim, and this is key to the idea of democracy, is that there is a convergence, that these various topically and or spatially distinct publics converge substantively, right, into this metatopical space, and then moreover that the metatopical public constitutes the demos of democracy, such that there can be collective action and decision through the public. This is a theoretical challenge and puzzle. Now, my last two sections are all, in a sense, more telegraphic. You'll be glad to know this ends soon. To talk about this in relation to the early 19th century, just to evoke some, but let me go back to the issue. Note, it's implicit in the LC Occupy question that I began with. Is it the case that to be a public requires boundaries or requires dispensing with boundaries? What is the right answer for the occupying students? Please tell me, I have to go back and have these conversations. Right? What is the right answer? They are giving, in one respect, a very classic late 18th century answer. You recall this was the era of corresponding societies, of the notion of the Republic of Letters, and of the idea of members unlimited. That the Republic classically had to be about members unlimited, an unbounded character. This had to do with people moving. Tom Paine, right, Britain to America, back to France, back to Britain, and eventually his bones carried back from America by way of comet, right? That there is a national movement, but it wasn't just about nations. A strong idea of unboundedness, this public of members unlimited. And this, of course, is being evoked by students to say, we won't really be free if you restrict us. If you say, well, LSE students have rights to occupy, but we can't bring in all the other students from Amsterdam or wherever else, right? That this is not freedom, but this is about publicness and its attention to the word. At the same time, it's a limit on the idea of this metatopical agency, that is, on constituting a demos. The absence of boundaries and the absence of what we might call, to gesture to Peter Bergman, sort of differential density of social networks, is an important issue in this. The constitution of the demos, through building connections among some people to be the public in relation to the state, is crucial and different from the dispersing of connections among members unlimited at an extremely large scale. The two of them coexist uneasily in this history. Similarly, the idea of counterpublics in publics raises a concern. It's a term introduced, counterpublic, by Knecht and Kluge to point out that Habermas failed to talk about the non-bourgeois publics that were developing at the same time. They called them plebeian publics, actually, we call them workers, whatever you want. And the extent to which the public sphere wasn't just made by these relative elites, but by contestation, I argue. In this radicalism, the extent to which the public sphere was always fought over all the time. That Habermas's narrative is in one sense misleading. It posits this creation of the public in these bourgeois institutions, and then problems that arise as it expands. Right? But I think it was created in part by expulsion. That is, it was in declaring that the public would not include a variety of subaltern or other forces, enforcing this by things like taxes on newspapers, to increase the prices such that they could be read only by the people. As literacy stopped being an adequate divide, because more and more people could read, other divides were introduced. I won't try to reproduce that story, but what I want to suggest is that there is a reality to this issue, and there's something misleading about it. The reality is, of course, that there are these contests over publicness. What's misleading is that very few people are ever happy to be a counterpublic. Counterpublics are generally alternative claims to the dominant public. The early 19th century, France, Britain, and elsewhere, there were a variety of more or less working class publics. Rassiere argued, one of them in these cases, they are not shaped by an utter rejection of everything bourgeois, they're shaped by being bloody pissed off about being left out of everything bourgeois, about blocked mobility opportunities. The same thing is true in Britain, and there are great figures like William Cobbett, a great popular journalist, an extraordinary figure of the early 19th century, writer of everything from the best-selling English grammar ever, to the founder of Hansard, the Public Records of Parliament, to the People's Register, and their activism, is furious, and repeatedly furious, about being described as, in fact, a special interest figure, as though the workers who were his audience were special interests. Even more, G.J. Wooler, editor of The Black Dwarf, is a key figure in this history of contests, right? A defender of print over public gatherings, because he thinks only people who deeply reason should be in public, but someone who would not be happy being a counterpublic because his claim is to democracy, to the demos, and to the right of everyone to enter it and shape its constitution. All of this. So there's a significant issue to counterpublics, and I think for the whole of it, they're not a happy story. Like, good, you can have the feminist counterpublic, right? They are a part of a story, contestation to the metatopic. Well, the contestation, the challenges go over for a long time. A feature of the classic public sphere idea is that it's oriented towards actors. Meaningful public public spheres, all of the examples that shape the Habermasian kinds of discussions have an orientation, classically and usually the state. And the public sphere derives its meaning as the English public sphere, the French public sphere oriented to the state, because the public sphere lacks executive power almost by definition. So the public sphere is organized to some vehicle for carrying that out. Now here, to begin to elaborate this, we need to see how it fits into the kind of story that Karl Polanyi outlined as double movement, the destruction of pre-existing solidarities, say craft communities, by industrialization, the building of new ones. Now, Polanyi is interested in new ones like insurance systems or welfare state systems, and these are indeed built in the response to the loss of family and community social support systems. But it's worth thinking of the public in this sense as well. That is, the creation of the public as itself a form of solidarity, not being the public before claiming various other material benefits, but the rebuilding through newspapers, through communication, through culture and imaginaries of a new kind of solidarity, and one that links citizenship, nation, and state. I don't have time to go into all of them. It's also worth noting, as I suggested already, there are other actors to influence, businesses, and there are civil society organizations, like philanthropy, for any manner of problems that are, say, Polanyi's problems, social needs that are not being met because the old forms of meeting them have been disrupted. There are various different kinds of choices about how to meet them. You can meet them with state programs, you can meet them with market mechanisms, you can meet them with philanthropy or charity. There are a range of these sorts of things. You can do self-organized civil society. This goes on through the whole modern period. If I haven't already talked too long, I could take it now into the struggles over, is anarchism pointless, right? Or is anarchism a vector of possibility for reorganization? So in Barcelona, or any city with a substantial population of self-organized support in urban communities, is that to be found inherently wanting because of its inability to scale up to large scale? Or is this the building, among other things, of large-scale politics in this? This is important because the biggest limit to conventional publics, evidently something we've already discussed, is the limits to states. That is, the extent to which state boundaries either limit who can be in the public, European problems of migration as they go on, it's a fundamental issue, who gets to be in the demos in basic ways, or the limits imposed by the opposite effect, numbers unlimited, and the disorganization of very large-scale publics in that sense. Citizenship isn't global yet. This isn't any mechanism. You can't get a global passport at this point. Some publics can be. It's a key question, is the extent to which they can be efficacious and who they address in order to be efficacious. Let's say actually states are still at the center of this argument, they haven't been transcended. Participation in the global is extremely hierarchically organized, like participation in European print publics of the early modern era. That grew into a larger scale mass public. We shouldn't write off the possibility of transnational publics. But we have other sorts of problems, like the fact that, say, in the case of Europe, the most important language of transnational European communication doesn't stay specifically European. English is in fact a global language, and so the media organized in English don't produce national solidarity the way that national language newspapers have produced a common public sphere and public solidarity. The issue of unbounded publics takes us back to this underlying question of what we mean by the demos of democracy. And I will close my comments on it by saying what we ought to mean is building the demos, not finding it and then asking whether there is an adequate public sphere to serve it, but publicness as itself the formation of solidarity. To talk about this in Europe is to immediately realize that we are indeed in a situation where ideals and institutions are radically divergent about this. And we could go into media, we go into government in various settings, but I need to close, so let me go to a concluding thought and try to go back. I can give a much longer list of ways in which publicness is challenged. One significant part of that would go back to the discussions of surveillance and the way in which they differ in Europe and the US, but the whole set of issues of unattractive publicness. And you begin to develop a case study around the different reactions to Google, or the different reactions to various information technologies in Europe and America around this, and different ideas that people struggle with how to constitute legitimacy in information technology. Throughout all of this, I think you would find reason to doubt the adage attributed to Stuart Brand and Holler's catalog, a common to the information industry, that information wants to be free. You would find that information, if it wants anything, doesn't seem to want to be free. It is organized in a variety of forms of unfreedoms and freedoms that are complexly entwined, and that are very much tied up with state law and structures differences. So, how can I generate a little bit of hope in this? Well, two comments. One is, back to the occupiers, that it may be liminal moments that are the most important, not enduring, or maybe rather, there may be a fundamental difference between how you get enduring institutions and how you change them. And that what's missing in that debate is the difference between very short-term existence, not quite phantoms, right? But the movements that last weeks or months or years, but go nowhere in terms of institution building, but change imaginaries and understandings the way people think. And the long-term institution building, which usually ends up beginning to feel like constraints, even when it starts out feeling enabling and dialectic between these. And the celebration of what is experienced only in liminal moments, as though it were the ideal for the permanent public sphere, may make us unreasonably cynical about the future's republic. Last, about university reform itself. The public sphere has shaped universities, but universities have shaped it. The public sphere has been in part a creature of intellectual life. The early accounts of this are reminders that intellectual life hasn't always been a European project. It didn't always been a university project. It didn't take universities to have the rise of early modern science. Scientific revolutions are produced more or less without universities. Reformation, the Enlightenment. Universities come into this story in a significant way later, mainly in the 19th century. And they rise and yet become, by the 20th century, important mainstays of the public sphere. They are internal publics, organizing communication among scholars, but they also are parts of the larger publics. In every major wave of social movements, they are public spaces. Among the dwindling public spaces in cities, university campuses become crucial. They are also organizations of proximity and contact. When young people become protagonists in protests, social movements of various kinds. And in an enduring sense, they are unusual institutions devoted to information being free. There's one set of challenges that universities face about how we work as institutions in a world where the organization of access to knowledge is radically changing, partly because of media changes, partly because of economic changes, government's not paying. And there's an important European story about this. I'll come back to it. But it's another story. What if universities are simply becoming progressively irrelevant? What if the transformation is one in which this particular need is being met by other institutions and other mechanisms? And the need to contribute, say, to large-scale discussion of major social issues isn't mobilizing mainly in academic participation, or the connections between the academics and the outside are weak, a different sort of problem. And finally, what if we have become our own worst enemies? That is, the internal public of universities is sufficiently limited, internal debate and discussion, seminars like this one, by virtue of the extent to which we are all organized in the pursuit of various other objectives. Articles in top journals, departmental rankings, and a variety of purposes, which are not easily avoided. Imagine me back negotiating with the occupiers as they insist that the professorial salaries should be reduced because there should be equality among all staff. And I try to explain to them that I don't think that will work, that we exist in a competitive environment, and the professors are not going to put up with this, and they'll go work somewhere else, and that there are certain material constraints. How much inequality can be tolerated? How can it be organized? Who pays? These sorts of questions are still basic to public life, and they are basic to our internal life in the universities as well. And my impression, sadly, not just of my university, but in general, is we aren't facing them very well. Thank you.